In the small town of Ashford, nestled in the hills of Virginia, life went on quietly. Here, everyone knew everyone else, and the local St. Mark's Church, located in the center of town, was not only a place of worship, but the heart of the community. Ashford residents flocked there to find comfort, share joys, or simply hear the kind words of Father Daniel McKinnon, a priest who had served the town for over a decade. Father Daniel was a man many looked to for advice. His words were often decisive in both spiritual and temporal matters. However, his unwavering outlook on life and belief in his own infallibility would soon become the center of a terrible scandal that would shake Ashford to its foundations. Maria Grayson, a 30-year-old woman with a heart of gold, was one of the church's most devout parishioners. Everyone knew her, from the children, for whom she organized Sunday lessons, to the elderly, whom she helped in their homes. Maria was that rare person who always found time for others, forgetting her own needs. Her bright smile and kind eyes had become a symbol of goodness in the small town. But no one could have imagined that it was in that church, between walls impregnated with prayers and hopes, that an event would occur that would make everyone doubt life and death, good and evil. One day, at the beginning of a cold October, Maria suddenly disappeared. She was not seen either at Sunday services or in the city park, where she used to walk with the neighbors' children. Phone calls went unanswered in her house seemed to have been hastily abandoned, causing alarm among the residents. Within days, the search began. No one expected Maria to be found dead, let alone in the most sacred place in the city. But this was just the beginning of a long and painful story that would reveal the dark sides of the human soul and force the town of Ashford to face a truth that could not be hidden, not even behind the walls of the church. It all began with the discovery of a body in a dark and silent parish room. It was the body of Maria Grayson. Her death was not only a tragedy, it was a brutal murder, committed with such terrifying coldness that no one could believe that the man they trusted with their deepest secrets was behind it all. The investigation of this crime would destroy trust and change lives, but until that moment, the residents of Ashford continued to believe that evil could not penetrate their quiet community. However, with each passing hour and with each new discovery by the detectives, it became clear that true evil can hide even in the most righteous of hearts. Thus began a story that would shake the town to its core, and soon, all the residents of Ashford would come to realize that no one is safe from the darkness that lurks behind the mask of holiness. A cold autumn wind blew through the streets of Ashford, stripping the last leaves from the trees. It seemed like a normal day. The market was bustling. Children were playing in the schoolyard, and the sound of bells echoed through the empty alleys. Yet something wasn't right. There was a tension in the air, subtle but persistent, as if nature itself were warning of impending disaster. In the early hours of the morning, when the city was just awakening, Lisa Carter knocked timidly on the door of St. Mark's Church. She had come, as she did every Sunday, to help Father Daniel prepare the church for service. Usually Maria was already there by that time, tending to the flowers or arranging the candles. But today the church greeted Lisa with an eerie silence that spread across the empty pews and extinguished the light that normally streamed through the stained glass windows. Lisa called out to Maria, her voice echoing in the empty room, but there was no answer. At first, she decided that her friend was simply late. She was late, but a slight anxiety gradually began to turn into fear. Her intuition told her that something wasn't right. This feeling did not leave her as she walked through the dark corridors of the church, heading towards the rooms where the priest and the parishioners used to converse. It was there, in a small room closed to the parishioners, that Lisa discovered something that would change her life forever. The light of a lamp barely penetrated the half-open door, tearing a terrifying vision out of the darkness. On the floor, among scattered books and papers, lay the body of Maria Grayson. At first, Lisa did not understand what was in front of her. It was too unexpected, too unimaginable. Maria's body was so mutilated that it was unrecognizable. And the first thing Lisa felt was not fear, but an inexplicable emptiness, as if reality had suddenly lost its meaning. She screamed, but her scream was drowned out by the walls of the church. Time seemed to stand still. The idea that her friend was dead did not immediately penetrate her consciousness. At that moment, Lisa could not understand how or who could have committed such an atrocity. Maria's body was covered in blood marks, and her face was so disfigured that she could only be recognized by her clothes and jewelry. But that horror wasn't the only thing that shocked Lisa. Behind Maria's body, a little to the side on the floor, lay a bloody cross, a symbol that the church they considered a refuge had now become the scene of a murder. It wasn't just an act of violence. It was a dark and merciless message thrown into the very heart of the community's faith and trust. Soon, the police arrived at the scene. Their heavy footsteps echoed through the halls as they examined the body and the crime scene. There were more questions than answers. Who could have committed such a brutal crime in a place that was supposed to be sacred? And why Maria? Allison Harper, a detective known for her keen intelligence and professionalism, took on the case, knowing it would be one of the most difficult of her career. Right away, Allison noticed a few peculiarities. First, the crime scene looked too clean, despite the brutality of the murder. There were no signs of a struggle, which was strange, given the state of Maria's body. In addition, her personal belongings were in place, which ruled out the possibility of a robbery. Everything indicated that the killer knew Maria and acted with confidence and cold-bloodedness. Looking around the room, Allison noted the scattered books and papers, many of religious content, indicating that Maria frequented that place. But what brought her there on that fateful day? Did she meet someone she trusted, who turned against her in such a cruel way? As the forensic team collected evidence, Allison began to analyze possible motives. This murder did not seem to be a random event. On the contrary, it seemed carefully planned and symbolic, as if the killer wanted to send some kind of message. But what message did he want to convey? The news of the brutal murder shocked the entire town. Residents could not believe that something so terrible could happen in their quiet corner of the world, where people always left their doors open and greeted each other with smiles. The church, which had always been a symbol of light and hope, was now covered in the shadow of fear and suspicion. Allison knew that a long and difficult road to the truth lay ahead. This murder was just a beginning, the catalyst that would bring to light the dark secrets hidden behind the facade of decency and faith. And she was ready to dive into that darkness, determined to find the answers that now tormented all of Ashford's inhabitants. With the first rays of sunlight breaking through the thick curtain of clouds, Ashford woke up to a completely different reality. The murder of Maria Grayson was a shock that shook every home and family in the town. Rumors spread at lightning speed, and each resident seemed to know more than their neighbor, adding their own version of events. Yet at the center of all the talk and speculation, one question remained steadfast. Who could have committed such a terrible crime? Meanwhile, for detectives Allison Harper and Mark Ridgway, this morning was no different than any other, except for the terrible events that had unfolded the day before. Allison had barely been able to close her eyes after a sleepless night. She was already sitting in her office, reviewing forensic reports and looking for any details that might shed light on this case. Mark, though he seemed calm, sensed the growing tension in the town where they had both spent over a year. Murders were so rare in Ashford that each case became special, but this one turned out to be simply out of the ordinary. The first thing that caught Allison's attention when examining the reports was the absence of any signs of a struggle. This meant that Maria either trusted her killer or was taken by surprise. However, what surprised her most was the state of the body. The injuries inflicted indicated that the crime had been committed with unusual cruelty. Forensic investigators found the murder weapon, a knife, abandoned at the crime scene. This was unusual, as most murders try to get rid of the weapon to complicate the investigation. But this criminal seemed to want to leave a message, and that was what worried Allison the most. Meanwhile, Mark was busy gathering information about Maria. Her life, at first glance, seemed flawless. A loving family, active participation in city life, devotion to the church. But Mark knew that behind a facade of perfection often lies secrets that can shed light on true motives. He began questioning her relatives, friends, and acquaintances, trying to build a complete portrait of her life and her final days. Many described Maria as kind and understanding, but some hinted that in recent weeks she had been more withdrawn and anxious, hiding something from everyone. Mark's first questioning led him to Lisa Carter, Maria's friend, who had discovered the body. Lisa was in shock and still couldn't believe what had happened. However, overcoming her emotions, she told Mark that in recent weeks Maria had become more reserved, losing herself in her thoughts and avoiding even discussing the church, which had previously been her favorite topic. Lisa noticed that Maria had started coming to church alone late at night when no one else was there, and that something was bothering her, although she never shared it with her. Meanwhile, Allison decided to focus on the crime scene. She understood that the key to solving the case could be hidden in small details that at first glance might seem insignificant. Father Daniel McKinnon offered to help her in examining the scene. Although his help seemed well-intentioned, something about his behavior struck Allison as odd. The priest was unusually calm for someone who personally knew the murdered woman and had seen her body in such a terrible state. This caught Allison's attention, and she decided to take a closer look at him. Father Daniel was a man of complex character. He was strict but fair, and although his faith was unwavering, his sermons sometimes alarmed some parishioners due to his rigidity in following the canons of the church. Allison felt that it was worth digging deeper into his past and seeing if any events in his life could shed light on the current investigation. While looking through the documents in the church, among books and records, she found something that caught her attention: Maria's personal diary. This diary was not only a record of her thoughts, but also a testimony of her experiences in the weeks leading up to her death. There were notes about her doubts, inner torments, and fears. One of the last entries mentioned a man in the dark who haunted her, even inside the church. This alarmed Allison even more. Meanwhile, Mark discovered something disturbing. Father Daniel was the only one who did not provide a clear alibi for the night of the murder. He claimed that he was in the church praying, but no one could corroborate his words, which further increased suspicions about him. However, there was still no direct evidence implicating him. Allison and Mark began to realize that the investigation was just beginning and that there were still many secrets to be uncovered. The key moment was the realization that behind the facade of a quiet town, many skeletons were hidden. The murder of Maria Grayson could be just the tip of the iceberg. Each new step and each piece of evidence found brought with it more questions. And though the answers were still unclear, detectives were determined to get to the bottom of the truth. The foggy morning found Ashford in anxious anguish. The murder of Maria Grayson had become the main topic of conversation on the streets, in the shops, and in the homes of a town where the priest had always been the embodiment of moral principles and spiritual guidance. But now, doubts were beginning to surface. People murmured, wondering if something dark and terrible was hiding behind Father Daniel McKinnon's facade of piety. Those who had once considered him a bastion of calm and confidence were beginning to question his true nature. Noticing the changes in Daniel's behavior, detectives Allison Harper and Mark Ridgway realized that the priest had become more withdrawn, avoided communication, and seemed to be increasingly lost in his own thoughts. Both knew that behind every mask could hide something that would explain current events, so they began to carefully study the priest's past. The investigation into his life led them to astonishing discoveries. Daniel McKinnon had been born and raised in a strict religious family. From an early age, he was groomed for church service, raised under the mandate of unconditional obedience to the religious canons imposed by his parents, who were men of iron will. They instilled in him strict moral principles that guided his life. But the deeper the detectives dug into his past, the more details emerged that contradicted his impeccable image. Mark discovered that Daniel had served in another diocese for several years before ending up in Ashford. In those years of service, not everything was as it seemed. Several parishioners had complained about his excessive severity and harsh methods in dealing with children at the church school. One of these complaints even led to an investigation, but the matter was hushed up and Daniel was transferred to another parish. For her part, Allison began to study his behavior over the past few months. What caught her attention the most was that several people close to Daniel had begun to distance themselves from him. Allison spoke to Amelia Ross, the church secretary, who knew the priest well. Amelia, ever loyal to Father Daniel, mentioned that she had noticed him becoming more irritable and reserved lately. She also told her about a strange conversation she had overheard between Daniel and Maria. Although she couldn't understand what it was about, the conversation seemed intense. Allison and Mark also noticed that Daniel was the last person to see Maria in the church on the day of her death. The priest claimed that they had discussed church-related issues and that Maria seemed a little worried, but that was the entire conversation. However, Daniel's testimony did not match the timeline provided by several witnesses who claimed to have seen him leave the church much later than he claimed. Allison began to suspect that Daniel might not be who he claimed to be. The connection between Daniel and Maria turned out to be deeper than previously thought. In Maria's diary, which Allison had found earlier, there were references to a man in black who often visited her at church and tried to convince her of something. These notes became more disturbing as the day of her death approached. Maria wrote that she felt trapped and did not know how to escape the situation, which alarmed Allison even more. However, so far, there was no direct evidence implicating the priest in the crime. His alibi, though dubious, could not be completely refuted. But both Allison and Mark knew they had to dig deeper into the investigation. The question was not only who killed Maria, but also why. What did Maria know that could have led someone, perhaps the priest or someone in his circle, to commit such a heinous crime? Meanwhile, the residents of Ashford began to suspect that the matter was much more complicated than they had first thought. More and more people began to distance themselves from the church, feeling like their faith had been shaken. It wasn't just a crisis of faith, but the realization that the man they blindly trusted could be hiding a horrible secret. Suspicions and fears began to eat away at the town's tranquility, transforming it from a peaceful place to one where anyone could be suspected. Allison and Mark decided to focus on the evidence to avoid making mistakes. They knew they were dealing with someone who was probably skillfully hiding their true intentions, but they also knew that the truth always comes out, and they were determined to find out what really happened on the fateful day Maria Grayson was murdered. As detectives continued to dig deeper into the case, the atmosphere in Ashford grew increasingly tense as the days went by. The town, which used to be quiet and friendly, was now shrouded in a fog of suspicion and mistrust. The murder of Maria Grayson and the growing suspicions about Father Daniel McKinnon had turned the community into a place where anyone could be the target of rumors. Conversations that began as innocent questions quickly escalated into heated arguments and eventually into accusations. At the local cafe, where residents often gathered to discuss the latest news, the topic of the murder became the center of attention. Someone recalled seeing Maria near the church late at night. Others mentioned strange changes in Father Daniel's behavior. Any detail, no matter how small, seemed important, and everyone considered it their duty to share information that could shed light on the crime. One of the most discussed topics was the connection between Maria and the priest. What relationship did they really have? And, more importantly, what secret had led to the tragedy? Many knew that Maria spent a lot of time at the church. She often helped with the organization of events and was close to Father Daniel. But now, after his murder, this closeness began to seem suspicious to people. They began to wonder what exactly connected them. Was it just a spiritual connection, or was there something more? Amelia Ross, the church secretary, was also drawn into this whirlwind of rumors. She was the only one who worked side by side with Father Daniel every day, and the villagers began to suspect that she might know something, even though she remained silent. Some even suggested that Amelia might be involved in the murder, as she was always around and knew all the internal affairs of the parish. Allison and Mark realized that rumors could not only increase interest in the case, but also complicate the investigation. They decided to start a series of meetings with local residents. Their goal was not only to gather more information, but also to try to calm tensions in the community. However, they quickly realized that stopping the flow of gossip would not be an easy task. At one of these meetings, they met John Miller, a local journalist who had been actively covering the investigation. He seemed to know everything about the detectives' movements and freely shared his thoughts with anyone who would listen. John was sure that there was something more behind the murder, beyond simple jealousy or personal enmity. He even suggested that the crime could be related to dark rituals or ancient rites that the priest supposedly performed in secret. Although Allison was skeptical, she realized that John might have important information, especially if he was in contact with people who were afraid to speak directly to the police. She decided to take note of some of his theories, although she did not consider them a priority. Meanwhile, Mark continued to question the members of the parish. He noticed that many of the parishioners who had previously supported Father Daniel were now beginning to distance themselves from him. Some even admitted that they felt uncomfortable during his last sermons, in which he spoke of sin and redemption with unusual passion, almost in a threatening tone. These words, which had previously seemed devout to them, now sounded to them like omens of something terrible. They could not help but feel that there was a hidden thread in his messages. Most surprising was that some of the most devout parishioners began to doubt their faith. They could not understand how the person in whom they trusted their souls could be involved in such a terrible crime. These doubts penetrated deep into their hearts and began to destroy the foundations on which their lives were based. Meanwhile, Lisa Carter, Maria's friend, who remained one of the few who still believed in Father Daniel's innocence, began to suffer rejection from her neighbors. Her faith in the priest seemed absurd in the eyes of those who had already condemned him for the crime, and Lisa began to notice a cold alienation from those she once considered friends. Her unwavering support for the priest began to seem strange, which only increased the suspicions around them. Allison and Mark knew that the situation was getting out of their control. The tension in the town could trigger unpredictable consequences, so they decided to speed up the investigation to avoid further discord in the community. They began to review every detail and piece of evidence even more carefully, hoping to find something that would lead them to the killer. But so far, answers remained elusive, and suspicions continued to multiply in the shadows of the quiet town. Fear loomed, and each day brought more mysteries. As the investigation progressed, detectives realized that each new discovery brought with it new questions. The investigation had entered a phase where, instead of clarifying the facts, each new piece of evidence seemed to confuse the case further. One of the first problems was that witness testimonies began to differ. Some residents claimed to have seen Maria and Father Daniel together the night before her death, while others insisted that the priest had already left the church when Maria arrived. These contradictions only made the case more complex. Allison understood that people could make mistakes, but the number of inconsistencies in the testimonies was alarming. Mark decided to go back to the beginning of the investigation and review the evidence collected at the crime scene. He noticed some details that had previously gone unnoticed, in particular the fingerprints found on the knife and cross used in the murder. Initially, it was assumed that all the prints belonged to Maria and Father Daniel, but upon rechecking, it was discovered that there were traces of another person. These prints did not match any of the known suspects. indicating that there might have been someone else at the crime scene. This discovery raised doubts about the idea that the priest acted alone and suggested the possibility of an accomplice, or even that someone else could have been the real killer. Meanwhile, Allison decided to double-check the priest's alibi. She approached parishioners who claimed to have seen him on the day of the murder. Upon questioning one of the witnesses, an elderly man named Henry Wallace, he eventually admitted that he was actually not sure he had seen the priest at the time he initially claimed. His original testimony was influenced by pressure from other parishioners who did not want to believe in Father Daniel's possible guilt. This confession further weakened the priest's position. Matters became more complicated when Mark found a second diary belonging to Maria hidden under her bed. The content was shocking. Maria described her fears and experiences with Father Daniel, mentioning that he would approach her with proposals that she found strange and even threatening. In her last entries, Maria wrote that she planned to tell someone about these proposals, but did not specify what exactly they were about. This new finding led Allison and Mark to suspect that Maria might have had a secret she was keeping, and that could have been the reason for her death. Most confusing was the mention of a third person in the diary, someone who Maria claimed was aware of her plans and was trying to stop her. This further complicated the situation, as it was unclear who this person was or whether he was an ally or an enemy. Meanwhile, the detective's attention was drawn to the financial state of the church. Records showed that large sums of money had passed through the church accounts in recent months, but the origin of the money was unclear. Furthermore, these sums were transferred to the priest's personal account, and their subsequent use was not documented. This discovery forced detectives to consider possible motives related not only to personal relationships, but also to financial interests. Allison also discovered that Father Daniel had previously been involved in controversial real estate transactions involving land belonging to the church. This could explain the origin of the money, but it did not clarify how it was related to Maria's murder. Each new piece of evidence only seemed to increase the number of questions. The case was becoming more and more complicated, and Allison and Mark began to suspect that there was something bigger behind it all, beyond simple personal motives or jealousy. Perhaps it was a conspiracy in which several people had a stake in Maria's death. Meanwhile, anxiety grew in the town. Residents no longer knew who to trust. Each new discovery, each new suspicion, added more tension to the situation. The once close-knit and friendly community began to fragment into groups, each with their own theories and suspicions. Allison and Mark knew that time was running out. They needed answers as soon as possible, before the situation got completely out of control. But the deeper they dug into the investigation, the clearer it became that this case was far more complex and dangerous than they had imagined. As the investigation entered a critical phase, Allison Harper and Mark Ridgway began to realize that there were deep, dark secrets behind Maria Grayson's death. The evidence they collected indicated that this crime was not just an act of violence, but the result of many hidden motives and intrigues intertwined in the lives of people who, until then, seemed blameless. The first clue emerged when Allison found an old folder of documents related to St. Mark's Church. Among many papers that seemed insignificant, she discovered several letters dated more than 10 years ago, addressed to Father Daniel. These letters were written by a woman who mentioned a mistake and an unacceptable sin they had committed together. Allison realized that these letters could be related to an event that happened before Father Daniel moved to Ashford. Mark, who was conducting a parallel investigation, discovered another important piece of evidence: a birth certificate hidden in a hospital archives, confirming that Father Daniel had a son born out of wedlock. This fact was carefully concealed, but when it came to light, it became clear that this secret could be an important motive for Maria's murder. Perhaps she had discovered the existence of the priest's son, which could have put her life in danger. At the same time, the church's financial reports continued to reveal new secrets. Money transferred to Father Daniel's personal accounts had been used to finance the construction of a private home in another state. This house turned out to belong to the same woman who had written the letters to the priest, revealing that Father Daniel had been in contact with her all these years. This suggested that she was trying to hide her relationship with her son. All of this forced Allison and Mark to reconsider their initial assumptions. They now began to suspect that the murder could be part of a larger conspiracy. It is possible that not only Father Daniel, but also other people associated with the church, had motives to eliminate Maria, who could have revealed these secrets. Allison decided to speak again with Amelia Ross, the church secretary. She was one of the few who might know something about the secrets hidden in the church archives. During the interrogation, Amelia admitted that she had long suspected that Father Daniel had connections that he carefully concealed. However, she was afraid to talk about it, as her own position depended on the priest, and she did not want to risk losing her job and respect in the community. Amelia also mentioned that in recent months, Maria had asked many questions about the church's finances, wondering where the money was going. She seemed to know or suspect something, but she did not share her thoughts. Amelia recalled the last time she saw Maria, a few days before her death. She was very worried and told her that she needed to talk to Father Daniel about something important, but did not specify what it was. Another relevant detail was that Amelia noticed an unknown man leaving the church on the day Maria was killed. He was dressed in dark clothes and seemed to be trying not to attract attention. At the time, Amelia didn't think much of it, but now this memory seemed crucial. It began to seem to Allison and Mark that this man could be the third person mentioned in Maria's diary. They decided to review the recordings of the surveillance cameras around the church to try to identify him. One of the cameras captured the silhouette of a man entering the church on the night of the murder. Although his face was hidden, his behavior was extremely cautious, as if he knew he could be noticed. Allison and Mark began to suspect that this man could be a hitman, or someone following Father Daniel's orders. It is quite possible that the priest, fearing that his secrets would be revealed, decided to remove Maria, but he did not want to do it himself. This hypothesis explained many of the contradictions in the case, but there was still not enough evidence. Therefore, the detectives decided to question Father Daniel again. They knew he was hiding something important, but they still didn't know how to get him to talk. They planned to use the conflicting evidence and newly discovered evidence to corner him and force him to reveal the truth. Meanwhile, a new wave of rumors and speculation spread through the town. Ashford residents began to realize that Maria Grayson's murder was just the tip of the iceberg, and that their quiet town held many more secrets than they could have ever imagined. People no longer felt safe, and distrust grew more every day. Allison and Mark knew they had to act quickly. They sensed that someone else might be in danger, and that the killer or his accomplice might strike again if they sensed their secrets were about to be revealed. The investigation was nearing its climax, and they were willing to do everything they could to stop the killer and protect those who might still be at risk. Father Daniel is arrested without resistance after his involvement in the murder of Maria Grayson is revealed. The news shocks Ashford, a deeply religious town, which must now confront the truth about the man in whom they have placed their faith. During the trial, it is revealed that Daniel ordered Maria's murder to hide his sins, including financial fraud and the existence of an illegitimate child. Stephen Fletcher, a private detective hired by Daniel to scare Maria, becomes a key witness, confessing that he killed her in a panic when she tried to escape. Father Daniel is found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, dividing the town between those who believed in his innocence and those who accepted the truth. St. Mark's Church, once the heart of Ashford, is left empty and neglected, reflecting the loss of trust in the community. Lisa Carter, Maria's friend, leaves town after being overwhelmed by grief and guilt. Amelia Ross, the church secretary, is ostracized for her role in the investigation. John Miller, the local journalist, writes thought-provoking articles about how beliefs can blind people to the truth. As the town begins to heal, Allison and Mark reflect on the depth of the lies they uncovered and how evil can lurk in the most unexpected places. Although the case is solved, its effects on Ashford and its inhabitants will be felt for a long time.